Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Rakib Ehsan. He is a writer, a researcher, a specialist in social cohesion, race relations in the UK and public security. He's also the author of a new book, Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. We spoke about fatherlessness and family breakdown as a factor in different outcomes across racial groups. We spoke about conflicts within different ethnic groups within the UK, which a lot of white progressives are completely oblivious to, about mass migration as a addiction on the part of our government. And in the extended part, we also spoke about attitudes towards all sorts of cultural questions like transgenderism and sexuality and feminism, and whether or not there's going to be schism within the Labour Party eventually between ethnic minority voters who are often very socially conservative on these questions and white progressives who are quite radical, and whether or not that political coalition can possibly hold, and whether or not a Muslim party is a likely outcome, as some people are saying. The extended part of the episode can be found at louiseperry.substack.com, where, as ever, you can also find the bonus episodes that I do fortnightly with my husband, the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. Rakib, could you start by just telling us a little bit about your professional background and I guess how that's fed into your latest book?
Sure. So my background is in race relations, social cohesion, and public security. I've authored a number of think tank reports in those research fields. I've lived pretty much all my life in Luton, a predominantly working class town, which has had its fair share of issues when it comes to community tensions. It's where the Butcher of Basra demonstrations took place, the Islamist protests, and the subsequent creation of the English Defence League. So I think in a way my upbringing and witnessing those kind of events really spurred me on in terms of exploring how we can create a more socially cohesive society.
Tell us more about the Butcher of Basra protest, because I'm vaguely aware of it, but I was quite young at the time, so I think a lot of people listening probably won't really remember it or won't have been familiar with it at the time.
No, absolutely. So essentially we had British soldiers who had served in the Iraq War parading through the town centre. And what we had Islamist demonstrators chanting "Butchers of Basra," and I think that created a great deal of local resentment, especially among white working class communities in Luton. And as I just said, that I think that is pretty much what facilitated the creation of the English Defence League. And I think during that time, the town was incredibly tense. I think the community tensions were very much at an all-time high following those incidents. But I think for all its flaws, the sort of anti-extremist, law-abiding and inclusive majority really worked together to try and move the town forwards. I think the town is in much better shape from from a social cohesion perspective. And naturally, the local football club getting promoted to the Premier League last season. I think it's amazing how civic football clubs, they're not just sporting institutions, they're vital community assets in their own right. And I think, in a way, it's those institutions that really help to get working class lads from different racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds to interact with one another. So it really can't underestimate the social value of institutions such as Luton Town Football Club.
Am I misremembering this, or is Andrew Tate from Luton?
Andrew Tate also has a Lutonian background.
Okay, not the town's kind of greatest son, but an interesting segue to one of the things in your book that I really wanted to talk about from the get go, which is the issue of family breakdown and fatherlessness, and how, which I know is something you're very interested in, and which has a great could potentially have a lot of explanatory power in looking at how different groups are faring in modern Britain.
No, absolutely. I think fatherlessness is something that I tackled in the book, and I did try to be as straightforward as possible in terms of articulating my views. I think generally, when we look at what shapes youth outcomes in Britain, there's not enough of an emphasis on family structure, household culture, and indeed, if there is a responsible male role model in the household to keep children, especially young lads, on the straight and narrow. I talked a great deal in the book about the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, what I call the brainless importation of US inspired racial identity politics. But I really think that if left leaning activists truly cared about young Black British lives, they would talk about the fatherlessness epidemic, which has taken hold in many inner city areas. And I think in those areas you have subcultures which, in my view, promote quite rampant forms of degeneracy. And there's almost a sense that it's a badge of honor to impregnate as many women as possible, which is quite remarkable because if you look at the Windrush generation, they certainly didn't hold those kind of values. Their Christian faith was very important to their identity. They really are far detached from what is going on in those areas in modern Britain, and I think it's become unfashionable to have children within wedlock and just to stick with one lady and to build a stable family of your own. And I think in those communities, of course, we can talk about how systems don't work for particular communities, and that is a debate to be had. But I think that if communities really want to lift themselves, they have to look at internal problems and be very honest about them.
I mean, Andrew Tate is a really good example of someone whose own father abandoned him, and he's
Mm,
actually, I think he's spoken about it in this like surprisingly poignant terms. And he is a completely absent father himself, and has had children, I think, by several women, and says quite publicly that he basically favors the harem model of reproduction, but without
no,
providing any.
I think there's many so-called. I think there's many anti-woke figures, Louise. I don't think they do the conservative cause any favors whatsoever.
Yes, yeah,
If
I don't think
if
either of
truth be
us are
told,
flying the flag for Andrew Tate.
mm,
He is
no,
interesting in
absolutely
that
not.
sense, in that he is like he is part of that family breakdown culture, both
Mm,
a product of it and also a promoter of it.
mm,
Um, and yeah, as you say, I mean, one of the things, of course, that's interesting, um, and I mean, one like a central argument of yours, which I completely agree with. I think everyone should agree with it if they just like look at even the basic facts about it. Is that it's not coherent to talk about BAME, which is the favoured term in the UK, or POC in America. It's not coherent to talk about non-white groups as if they
mm.
had really much of anything in common, and that's particularly true when it comes to things like family breakdown
Oh,
and fatherlessness. Like the difference in rates across groups is enormous.
oh, it's astonishing. If you look at ONS data, looking at the rates of lone parent households for children aged up to 15, the rate within the Black Caribbean origin population is as high as 63%.
Mm.
And it goes all the way down to 6% for their peers of Indian origin. For the white British mainstream, if I remember correctly, it's 19%. So 1 in 5, which for me is still uncomfortably high. So I think what it really shows is that there are significant disparities within the wider non-white population when it comes to family structure. And I think we really need to look at family structure and household culture when it comes to analysing youth outcomes, whether it's mental health, physical well-being, cognitive development, level of educational attainment, and then further down the line, labour market integration in adulthood. And I think it's a real shame that in recent times, British social policy has been very much focused on protected characteristics, especially race and ethnicity, when I almost think that family has become uh, it's a non-topic in our mainstream politics. I think I'll tell you who are the biggest culprits. Progressive leftist politicians who say, "Oh, there's a variety of family models which are very successful." Yes, successful families can come in different shapes and sizes. Now, if you're raised in a stable two-parent household, you're not guaranteed to be a remarkably successful individual. Equally, if you're raised in a lone parent household, and I really want to make this point, this isn't about stigmatizing single mothers in particular, many of whom try their utmost to raise their children in a good and proper way under very difficult circumstances. But I think we need to be honest about which family models are most strongly associated with positive youth outcomes, whether it's level of education attainment, not getting involved in the criminal justice system, and then making progress in life when it comes to employment. I think it's very clear that a stable two-parent household, ideally headed by a married couple, which reduces the chances of the couple breaking down, that is most strongly associated with positive youth outcomes and young people's personal development. I think it's a crying shame that progressive politicians who actually have that upbringing, who have also themselves got married and have had children within wedlock, then say, "Oh, but anything goes." I think that it's a grave injustice in itself.
No, I agree with you. I had a chapter in my first book on marriage and why it's good. I didn't really talk about like I didn't go into as much detail as you have done in terms of child outcomes and stuff. I was really making an argument actually of it being good for women. Um, but the number of times I got criticised for that specific argument by people who are themselves married and have had clearly recognised the personal advantages that can come with
Mm.
marriage, let alone the advantages to your children. But yes, there's a sort of there's a hypocrisy there, I think, from progressive elites who don't want to mandate the choices that they themselves prefer.
Oh no, absolutely. I think they're more focused on appearing trendy, fashionable, and overly inclusive. And I think that when it comes to social policy making, we can't be guided by people's efforts to appear overly virtuous in the public sphere. We have to be honest
Mm.
about what works best when it comes to the progression of our young people in Britain. And it's very clear that evidence is there. Think tanks such as the Centre for Social Justice, fantastic organisation, has produced a lot of relevant research. The evidence is very clear that family structure matters a great deal. And I think that it's a real shame that our politicians simply don't talk about that enough. And I also think it's a shame, Louise, if you'd allow me to make this point, that we have many so-called traditionalists in the Conservative Party who are more than happy to make Boris Johnson leader of the so-called Conservative Party.
Mm.
And I think it's very difficult for any Conservative government to really run with a family-centric social policy when you have a significant section of the British political right idolising a man with a very chaotic family and indeed marital history.
I agree with you. I'm one of these very unfashionable people who actually really would be. I am. really put off voting for a politician if he's adulterous, which is very common, right? Or if she's adulterous, it's more often with men, right? But I think if you are willing to betray the people you love
Mm.
most in the world, why on earth, as a voter, would I not expect you to betray me, to whom you have far fewer like emotional connections and obligations? It just seems like obviously a terrible mark against someone's character in that sense. Which is not to say like we never forgive, yada yada, but like all things being equal, I'm going to disfavor someone who is treacherous in his personal life.
Oh, no, absolutely. I feel exactly the same way. If truth be told, there's many people who say that no, it doesn't really matter as long as they perform well in their public role, and that if their policies make a significant impact in terms of bettering British society, that's good enough for me. Unfortunately, we have politicians who are not able to do that for one reason or the other. But on top of that, they have a very questionable life history. And I do think that if you're willing to betray and be disloyal to your closest and dearest, I certainly think you're very able to sell off the country silver as well.
Yeah. Um, Going back to ragging on white progressive middle class people, which is of course, I mean, these are my people, so I can be rude
It's a
about
great
them.
hobby.
Exactly. I honestly think that a big part of what's going on in terms of what you write about, not just in your book but elsewhere, the sort of the intricacies of inter-ethnic um, uh, inequalities and tensions within the UK.
Mm,
I think that most white middle class progressives just don't know anything about that. Is my
mm,
strong impression. There just isn't anywhere near the understanding of how different groups differ from one another, which is largely, I think, just because there isn't actually a lot of social contact between groups, even in a city like London, which is now majority
mm,
minority. I think many people who are in positions of authority in media, government, what Matt Goodwin calls the new elite, I just don't think there's anything like the social understanding of, I don't know, like a case recently that I've heard you speak about, and which I also found sort of telling in this sense, was the Peckham hair
and
shop.
cosmetics.
Yes, right. Can you remind listeners who are not aware of this what happened with that and why it was revealing of some of the politics here?
So, Peckham Hair and Cosmetics, believe me, it won't come as any surprise. I'm not generally familiar with hair and cosmetic products, but there you go. It's an Asian-run business, but it sells products which are, how do you say, quite heavily consumed by Black British communities. And there was a Black customer who was accused of taking products that she wasn't entitled to. The accusation of stealing. And this actually resulted in a physical altercation involving the Asian shopkeeper in this case and the Black customer, who was a lady. And the fallout from that was quite remarkable. There were protests outside the establishment. There were also racist messages stuck to the front of the shop, such as "Go to hell, Patel," referring to parasitic merchants, which is the sort of racist language that was used during the time of Idi Amin Dada in Uganda, when the Ugandan Asians were expelled with 90 days' notice. So I think what it really showed, that in this southeast London district, that some of the most serious tensions, and it is something that was it is very similar dynamic to parts of Birmingham as well, where there's almost there's a community tensions based on one particular ethnic minority group buying property, running businesses which sell products which are quite popular and well consumed by other ethnic minority groups. And it almost creates a resentment in itself, that kind of the difference in rates of business ownership in those particular areas in regards to particular goods as well. But what it really shows is that many of our politicians have no clue. about these kind of social tensions. And the reality is some of the sharpest social and political tensions in the UK do not involve the white British mainstream whatsoever. And I think that was also demonstrated last year with the large scale public disorder in Leicester, primarily between Hindu and Muslim youths, where we essentially saw subcontinental style sectarianism spilling out on the streets of a regional English city.
Mm. Yeah, I know Peckham quite well, and it is quite striking how on Rye Lane, like the high street, you have Asian. The shops are overwhelmingly run by South and sometimes East Asian people.
Mm,
I think often families are running these shops, but customers are overwhelmingly black because Peckham is a very well, specifically Peckham is a very West African region. It's not actually Black Caribbean as such. Like this is the sort of like conflict between, say, West African, relatively recent migrants and more long-standing Caribbean
mm.
communities is exactly the sort of which is quite significant. Like,
It is.
yeah, is exactly the sort of thing that white progressives are completely is invisible to them. But anyway, in Peckham, it's very obvious, basically, that the Asian shopkeepers are doing a bit better economically generally than their customers, and they're clearly working very hard and often recently arrived, and whatever. It's not like they're
Mm.
they're not rolling in it, but there clearly is a difference between these groups, which is not missed on the customers and the locals, which is a big part of what fed it, as you say, parasite was it parasite merchants,
Parasitic merchants, yeah.
right? Which I mean, I believe as well that was one of the things that led to the LA riots in 1992. Although in that case it was South Korean immigrants who were running shops in black areas, and there ended up being this kind of uh, this exact this exact style of tension where everyone is minutely focused on how relatively well economically different groups are doing,
Mm.
and it's very easy for people to feel um, resentful.
No, absolutely, and I think it's really good that you flagged the differences between West Africans and Black Caribbeans. And indeed, that there's a great deal of diversity within the broader Black African category as well. That could include an established West African Christian migrant, or
Mm,
it could also include a recently arrived Muslim refugee from the Horn of Africa, such as Somalia. But what's quite interesting in terms of the differences between Black Africans and Black Caribbeans, as you say, Black Caribbeans are more established in terms of duration, going all the way back to the Windrush generation. Black Africans, on average, tend to be more recently arrived. But if you look at educational outcomes, for example, pupils of Black African origin in England fare considerably better than their
mm,
co-racial peers of Black Caribbean origin, and they're less likely to be expelled
hmm
from school as well. And I think that when you're looking at tensions, it's very interesting because this is research that I've done myself a couple of years ago. 1 in 6 respondents of Black Caribbean origin had an unfavourable view of Black Africans living
mm,
in the UK. That's not a irrelevant number by any stretch of the imagination. 1 in 6.
mm.
I think that going in the other direction, it was 6%. 6% of Black African origin respondents having an unfavourable view of
Interesting.
Black Caribbean heritage people. So I think that what it really, and I think in a way, the emergence of BLM, I think you saw those tensions, not so much along ethnic lines, but along political lines, really come to the fore within the wider Black British population. And there were some people who were incredibly frustrated with more conservative minded, patriotic Black Britons, the classic name calling, turncoat, coconut, and all the rest of it. And I think what it really shows is that some of those tensions within ethnic minority communities are incredibly intense.
Mm, mm. Was BLM? I got the impression, but you'll know better than me, that BLM was primarily a Caribbean cause, that there wasn't as much involvement from African migrants, but I might be wrong about that.
Well, I think the research I did found that people of Black Caribbean origin had warmer feelings
Towards
towards the Black Lives
right, right,
Matter
right,
movement,
right, and cooler
and
feelings
more,
towards the police.
indeed,
Mm-hmm.
and I think once again, but there's a variety of factors at play. Many Black Africans are indeed recently arrived, so they've experienced how truly corrupt and brutal policing can be in their countries of origin back on the African continent. So, for all the flaws of British policing, they're more likely to have positive orientations towards British policing just based on that. And of course, we should be very clear about the legacy of the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, a Jamaican origin teenager back in 1994. And that was so badly handled
Mm.
by the Met. Quite remarkable. Doing carrying out an undercover investigation of their own into Stephen Lawrence's family on the back of him being murdered. So I don't think we should trivialize the impact of that, even though that was nearly 30 years ago. I think the casts a very long shadow. But I think what it really shows when you're looking at things such as social cohesion, but also levels of institutional trust, it's very, very important to disaggregate and not treat, never mind non-white people, but even labels such as Asian, black, and indeed white can be incredibly homogenizing and mask over very real ethnic differences.
Right. Last time I looked at the data, the group of people who absolutely love the police the most are Bangladeshi women. They're like
Indeed,
incredibly
indeed.
pro-police. Yeah.
Indeed, and I think I'm predominantly a Bangladeshi origin myself, and I think that's quite an interesting story because we talk a great deal about law and order and also post 9/11 securitization, leading to this sort of widespread victimization of British Muslims at large. As you know, the Bangladeshi ethnic group is Sunni majority, but that's not really born in, that doesn't come through with the data at all. In fact, when you look at communities which are most security oriented and have quite robustly conservative positions on law and order, you'll find those quite attitudes run quite deep in many British Muslim communities.
Mm, mm. Um, the elephant in the room, right, when we're talking about attitudes of British Muslim communities, is the recent protests in
Mm,
particularly in London, but elsewhere. And one of the things that really jumped out to me in looking at, I didn't go along to any of them. I know some people who did as sort of as journalists, and I saw photos and videos and so on. Is that the crowds were mostly, though by no means exclusively, ethnic minority people, but from very different groups, right? Like there aren't actually
mm,
that many Arabs in the UK, and there definitely aren't that many Palestinians in the UK. There's only like 3,000 Palestinians in the UK or something. So nowhere near enough to be forming a majority of these very, very large crowds in London in particular. You had lots of South Asians,
mm,
North African and Middle Eastern, like lots of different groups, and also some uh, Sub-Saharan African Muslims. But the thing that really jumped out to me is like, wow, Islam is a very, very unifying ideology. Like to have turned out this many people who otherwise, as we've discussed, have lots of internal conflicts on various things. But actually, this issue seems to have an incredible like community formation ability, for better or worse. Did you get the same impression from following these protests?
no, absolutely. I mean, first, you'd make the point that Israel-Palestine and the ongoing conflict in Gaza is ultimately a humanitarian issue, and some of the strongest voices who very much believe that the Israeli government is responsible for a remarkably oppressive form of militaristic occupation and indeed population displacement in the West Bank. That's not exclusively held by British Muslims. There's
Mm,
non-Muslim commentators who make those very points.
mm,
But I think you're absolutely right to talk about the diversity within the wider British Muslim population. And I've heard many people say, oh, why do British Muslims care about this so much in the Middle East? They're British. Yes, they're British, but if you have an understanding of the concept of the Ummah
Mm,
in Islam, the idea of there being a global, worldwide Islamic community, then those kinds of developments, like the ones that we're seeing right now in the Middle East, there are British Muslims, especially if they have a very strong religious identity, which, to be honest, most British Muslims do.
mm,
That's the truth of it. They are going to feel that quite deeply, and I think there's perfectly legitimate criticisms to be made of the Israeli government. I think where I took issue with the protests is that they were very clearly quite aggressive forms of anti-Semitism at the protests. There's also pro-terror paraphernalia being displayed, and I think that, to be honest, the Met was found wanting. If truth be told, there was a lack of robust policing on that front. Uh, but it's very clear to me that developments in other parts of the world, they can have an impact on social cohesion in the UK, and that is worrying. And I think that what it really shows is that the UK government moving forwards, uh, the point I make is that diversity is not an unalloyed and unadulterated good by any stretch of the imagination, and in some cases is very difficult to manage. And I think that as we head into the future, I think we really need to be aware of how foreign territorial disputes and indeed conflicts abroad, how they can threaten social solidarity in the modern British context, and we need to be honest about the risks.
I mean, yeah, the Israel-Palestine conflict is the most powerful in this sense, the one that it can
Mm,
turn people out on the streets most readily. It's not unique though, and it is. Did you see? I think it was weekend before last or something. There was Albanian Independence Day.
indeed.
I could not tell you what day Albanian Independence Day is. I know nothing of any of this, right? But it was. There are enough of Albanians in London that there ended
Mm,
up being like a massive event in central London, which was quite disruptive because all these young blokes like bringing their cars and causing like having
mm,
conflict with police and everything. And it's, I mean, that's not like a foreign war that's causing
mm.
tensions back home, but it is an example of like people don't just forget where they came from.
Oh
They don't
no.
just abandon their traditions, positive and negative, or their conflicts with neighbors, right? That these things persist, including cross generationally, which is maybe surprising if you have a more optimistic view of assimilation and assume that people born in the UK are going to just sort of seamlessly slip into British traditions and so on. But that doesn't seem
Mm.
to be actually what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that idea of, as you go down the generations, people become more integrated. In some ways, they will become more integrated. I think British
Mm,
Muslims are becoming more integrated in an educational and economic sense.
hmm
You can see a number of UK-born British Muslims rising through the ranks in our politics, but also our trade unions and business confederations in the
mm
country as well. And I think that
And
that should be
you see lots
celebrated.
of hijabi students as well at universities. Lots of young British Muslim women
That
going to university.
Absolutely,
Mm,
and I think that the issue is that you have to look at what you mean by integration. I think in some ways, as people become more integrated, and you have to understand that UK-born British Muslims, they may have a very strong ethnic and religious identity, but their frame of reference is very British. They're not going to have an automatically and naturally positive orientation towards British democracy because they originate from Pakistan or Bangladesh or the Middle East or North Africa. So that means they may have higher expectations when it comes to rights and freedoms from the British state when compared to their parents and grandparents. So
mm.
there's an expectations difference across the generations as well. And I do think that when we're looking at Israel-Palestine, you mentioned the Albanian Independence Day celebrations. It was a very important dynamic in Leicester as well, with the large scale public disorder last year, where you had more established ethnic minority residents in the city many of them East African Asians who fled the process of Africanization in the 60s and 70s. We're actually complaining about recently arrived migrants, saying that they're not very familiar with sort of traditional British social norms. They celebrate festivals like deep into the morning, in the early hours, during the middle of the week. So this idea that it's only the sort of established native white British mainstream that have issues with certain impacts of immigration is entirely false.
Oh yeah, and I actually think that if anything, I'm just thinking of like ethnic minority, upper middle class people that I know. I think they tend to be a bit less hesitant about voicing those complaints as well. Um, so yes, it's not hard to find like really quite surprisingly right wing opinions expressed by um, ethnic minority people in relation to immigration.
Oh no, absolutely, it's people think that your concerns surrounding immigration that they're certainly not exclusively held in the Tory voting provinces. I
Mm,
can tell you that much. It's actually some of the highest levels of concern, the belief that the immigration is currently too high. It cuts across many of Labour's what I call Asian heritage heartlands, including
mm,
my hometown of Luton, but also Leicester. I think that there's even parts of Bradford where concerns over immigration, the levels of it are particularly high in predominantly Asian heritage areas. So I think there's something for us to think about when we have our discussions on immigration, which I think at times are a bit they're a bit narrow in nature.
mm, mm. What are the sort of opinions that you're likely to hear in, say, somewhere like Bradford in relation to immigration? Is it hostility to illegal immigration, or I don't know, some groups getting preferential treatment, or like what are the kind of internal dynamics of how people regard the immigration debate in the Asian heartlands,
Well,
as you say?
I think that sort of Luton, for example, voted 56.5% leave, which some people still find
Interesting.
it remarkable when I tell them that. And there's a part of Hounslow in West London called Osterley and Spring Grove, very nice area, affluent, many Indian origin families with high rates of home ownership,
Mm,
voted leave by over 63%. And
mm,
I just found it remarkable. You had all these London-based journos going to the provincial Midlands, going to Northern England, trying to find passionate Brexit voters when they could have just gone to the Munders and Gurdwaras in West London. They would have found plenty of Leave voters there.
mm,
And one of the concerns was that we ultimately had a two-tier immigration system. The EU freedom of movement principle, because of this, the UK immigration system ultimately treated EU migrants in a way that they were the beneficiaries of preferential treatment. And there's the argument that why does a sort of well-educated mechanic, for example, from Kolkata in India, who may speak English very well, why do they have to go through these rigorous assessments? And they should go through those rigorous assessments and tests before relocating to the UK. Why do they have to go through those procedures? And I support them going through those procedures, but why is that standard, or rather, why are those assessments not applied to
mm,
EU migrants? And I
mm,
think that was a perfectly reasonable argument to make. What's also very interesting is that in certain parts of the country, there's even been concerns over Ukrainian refugees being expressed by established South Asian origin communities, concerned that Ukrainians traditionally are not very used to living in racially diverse environments. So how will they integrate? How will they find living in modern Britain? And as you all know, we have the ongoing small boats emergency on the English south coast, which I think that take for example a refugee who genuinely fled persecution and was at serious risk of being killed in their homelands and then being provided sanctuary in the UK. Why on earth would they be supportive of that form of irregular migration? More than anything, they'll be especially sensitive to what we're seeing on the English South Coast. So I think it's very important to understand those dynamics when we're talking about immigration and then moving forwards, what kind of immigration system we should have for post-Brexit Britain.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, listeners from outside the UK might not know, but we have a very high proportion of senior politicians in the Conservative Party, in particular,
Mm,
from East African Asian backgrounds. So, particularly uh, people whose families of Indian heritage fled Idi Amin's regime in Uganda. And they tend to be, like very anti-small boats. Suella Braverman,
mm.
former Home Secretary, in particular, really flying the flag for immigration restrictionism. So yes, I mean the discussion over this is not a straightforward one. I mean, presumably people are more likely to be in favour of, say, chain migration that allows people to bring over family members. I would imagine people whose families are still overseas would generally be more in favour of that, but then less in favour of, as you say, small boats and illegal routes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it may differ from group to group in terms of levels of support for family reunification, which is a stream of migration, a very established type of migration as well. But I think as certain communities, especially the communities which have become more integrated, especially Indian origin communities, I think that you see quite often now that sort of recent marriages, they tend to be between UK citizens. They may
Mm.
be within the British Indian population, but they are generally between UK citizens, and I think that's not necessarily the case, or not at such a high level, perhaps when we're looking at people of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin, and I think that when we're looking at immigration more generally. If you look at foreign students, for example, who, to be honest, many of our universities are very reliant on their fees and social activity. I think that it's possible not only to bring your spouse and dependents, but even unmarried partners. Which I think it shows that immigration, which talk about immigration restrictionism, I think that's an incredible form of immigration relaxation, more than anything. And I think just to make this point is that I think there's one of those contradictions why, heaven knows, why Boris Johnson is so adored by elements of the British political right, because our current immigration system, where we're getting net migration figures up to 745,000, this is post Brexit Boris style internationalism on steroids. There's no two ways about it.
It's amazing, isn't it? And then you read him in the mail saying, "Oh my goodness, immigration's out of control," and it's like, hold up, who was it
Yeah.
who lowered the income threshold and all of this stuff, which has led to very large increases lately? Which, yes, is partly to do with Ukrainian refugees and people coming from Hong Kong, but
Mm.
that's still quite a small part of it. If you're looking at the numbers, a lot of it is work visas for relatively low skilled work and family members coming over. Like, for instance, you can bring your gran if you come over with a student visa. Um, is just one example of the rules being quite lax when it comes to some routes into the UK.
No, no, absolutely. There are one-off factors that we have to consider. For example, the Kremlin's invasion of Ukraine, the Chinese communist regime's a totalitarian approach to governing Hong Kong as well. But it's very clear that we have a very liberal and open immigration system, and then there's very high numbers coming from countries such as India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and China. So I find it absolutely remarkable that many people, I'm sure you've seen this as well, they say that this is the most racist government when it comes to immigration policy. I see no evidence
Mm.
of that whatsoever. More than anything, what's happened with immigration is that there's been a sharp rise in overall numbers, but there's been a fundamental shift from EU nationals to non-EU nationals. So I don't see much evidence of how do you say, a white only immigration system at play here in the UK.
Mm. I think last year there were more people from Nigeria than from the whole of the EU. So yeah, it just
Mm,
does show how things have changed post Brexit. I think that the mistake people, many on the left, are making is they listen to what the Conservatives are saying, but they don't look at what they're doing. Because you will hear, not least from Suella Braverman, who we've already discussed, some quite restrictionist rhetoric. and particularly around small boats and so on. But that doesn't seem to be actually what's being done. And indeed, that's true of other. I mean, we don't have a populist right party in power in the UK.
Mm.
Obviously, lots of European nations do. Most recently, the Netherlands, but also Italy, Giorgia Meloni in Italy. You know, immigration is still really high under Giorgia Meloni for all of her anti-immigration
Mm.
rhetoric. So, um, you know, you could look at those, you could look at Maloney and Suella Braverman and so on and say, you know, the sinister far right, yada yada. We've all heard it from their critics on the left, right? But that's not actually what they're doing in terms of policy.
No, I think that the story of immigration-related politics on the right, more generally, is that there's a huge gap between the rhetoric and policy reality, indeed
Mm,
policy delivery. And I think that if you look at our own Conservative Party here in the UK, it's very clear. It's addicted to mass immigration. They see immigration as a lever to pull to engineer economic growth. Heaven knows why. Because we've had a low growth, high immigration model for a very long time. And I think, in a sense, we've become so reliant on cheap foreign labor. I think that's deterring investment in terms of infrastructure upgrades, automation in particular sectors, the use of artificial intelligence and nanotechnology, in sectors such as agriculture. And ultimately, the problem is that we simply haven't invested in our own people,
mm,
in terms of trying to lift educational standards, improve vocational skills. I always said that it would be great to have a German-style vocational college in every provincial town in the country,
mm,
a well-sized provincial town, and I just see a lack of ambition, and,
mm,
and there's a lack of passion in terms of trying to maximize the potential of our own domestic workforce. In terms of health and social care, we should have, a far higher level of bursaries, apprenticeships, on-the-job training. I think that that's ultimately what national self-sufficiency, which I consider to be a classic conservative principle, that's what it should be about. But the current Tory party doesn't seem very interested in it at all.
No, well, it's very easy, I think, for governments to be short-termist about this and think that, as you say, you know, addicted to low skill migration. When I was a child, I remember, because it was a highlight of my weekend often, going to the automated car wash and having your car cleaned by the machine, right? I don't know of anywhere near to us now that does automated car washes. I know lots of places that have um, people on dirt poor pay doing car washes by hand. And you look at, there's one near us, and I always walk past and I think, like, is I'm like deeply distrustful of this business. Like, is there modern slavery going on? Like, like
Mm,
people who really cannot speak English, and you think, well, you know, what is going on with this business? I'm not going to put my money towards it, right?
mm,
My car is filthy as a consequence. But like, that's just one example of um, we seem to have actually gone backwards on automation because I guess from a lot of business perspective, it's cheaper to just employ very, very low paid, low skilled people rather than to invest in uh, expensive machinery. And similarly, like with the, you mentioned about healthcare training. I mean, you probably don't know because I don't talk about it very much, but I was almost a doctor. I went to medical school and dropped out. And there's, there are a lot of limits placed on how many. Medical school places in the UK typically have 10 applicants to a place, and most 18-year-olds in this country who apply to go to medical school will not get in. It's very, very competitive. And part of the reason for that is not just because obviously you want to have very high standards, of course you do. It's because the government for a long time has capped the number of doctors that we train, and I think also the number of nurses and midwives, because there are limited numbers of jobs in the NHS. So they don't want to have this enormous excess, because it's very expensive to train someone, right? They don't want to have this enormous excess of newly qualified people per place. And so we've ended up with a very low number of well, what we've ended up with is a shortfall. We don't actually have enough homegrown trained medics for the jobs that need to be done in the NHS. So we've ended up importing loads of people from overseas, and often importing people from countries where their medical training is not actually as
Mm.
good. And so they need to be either, requalify when they're here, or you end up with, expectation gaps from patients, right? And I mean, in a way, I guess the government save money because they're not having to invest in training people, but also they're like suppressing the ambitions. You think of all these like young
Mm.
young British people who got 3 A's at A level, were completely qualified to go to medical school, and yet were prevented from doing so because of this cap. And then, they look around and see people being brought in from overseas, and basically it's the NHS or it's the government trying to save money, but it's just incredibly short term. And to me, is just indicative of the whole approach that we've seen in recent decades.
Mm.
From I mean, not just the Conservative Party, Labour as well. This is a problem. It's
Oh, of
both parties
course,
are as
no,
bad as each
absolutely.
other.
The new Labour government has to take a lot of responsibility as well. With a very similar mindset. For me, this is where my left-wing conservatism really comes to the fore. I would support a very high tax, high spend agenda if it had the central purpose of rehabilitating Britain from its addiction to mass immigration, of a long-standing addiction. I think the route to future sustainable economic growth is investing in the skills of our own people, British people. Heaven knows why people think this sounds ethno-nationalist, because we have a very diverse population now in
Mm.
modern Britain.
Oh, I
That's
mean,
the
when I
truth of
say
it.
homegrown British doctors, like, there's a very
No,
high chance they're going to have a surname of Patel, right? Like,
absolutely, 100%. And I think as well, we really need to invest in our infrastructure. And ultimately, for our younger people, we need to have a safer Britain, which is a nicer place to live.
mm,
And that includes upgrades to things such as, public transportation systems as well. I just think there's a very clear lack of ambition, government after government. And as you say, they see it as ultimately saving costs by importing very large numbers of foreign workers. And in terms of healthcare, we have to make the point as well. There is the possibility that the training quality may not be as good, but they could be perfectly capable medical professionals who have
hmm.
been trained in a country which is nowhere near as developed as the UK, who are now working in the NHS. So their country of origin is deprived of their services.
Oh,
Now we
yeah.
have
I
to
mean,
consider,
the brain
yeah.
drain effect is like
So,
brutal to these countries. The number of like Caribbean nurses, for instance, that we have acquired and basically deprived the Caribbean of women that they've invested in. It's really scandalous, actually, that the left would support countries doing that.
Absolutely. So certainly not ethical from a, if you could call it a global justice
Mm,
perspective at all. And I think crucially, I think that it's really important to invest in maximising the potential of young people. I still think we have a education system which doesn't promote vocational skills enough. In fact, I still think there's a cultural snobbery which still exists
yeah, I think that's
on
right.
that front, which very much needs to be countered. But the point is that we are in the post-Brexit environment. There's no real active industrial strategy in the truest sense of the term. And I think it's a crying shame. And whether or not that would change under a future Labour government, I wouldn't hold my breath.
No, I don't. I don't hold up much hope for Labour improving on this front at all. I mean, I don't. I don't really know what's going to happen, to be honest, because yes, it's very clear that the Conservatives have not. Well, they've taken Brexit literally not seriously, right? So we did leave the EU, but
Mm,
I don't think it's controversial to say that a lot of people voted for Brexit, right? Not actually including me. I voted Remain, and I'd still vote Remain, but a lot of people voted for Brexit because they wanted to see lower rates of immigration, and the
mm,
opposite has happened. So I don't, there's clearly a great sense of betrayal directed at the
mm,
Conservative Party from a lot of voters, but Labour are not actually offering. I know that Keir Starmer is you know talking the talk a bit at the moment. I saw
mm.
him in the Telegraph at the weekend doing as much, but
Indeed, as did I.
yeah, but I don't really believe him because I know what the membership think in the Labour Party. I
Mm,
know how radical many of his progressive MPs are. And I think that his attempts to woo the sort of red wall, right populist leaning voter base, I don't think they're actually going to be, I don't think we're going to see that implemented in policy.
No, I think we're very much on course for a Labour return to government
Mm,
in the very near future. But I don't sense there's a great deal of national enthusiasm over that. I think it's more of the fact that there may well be a significant chunk of British voters who think that the time is up for the Conservatives. It's time to get out of government, perhaps regroup in opposition,
mm,
establish a coherent programmatic identity. Indeed, it may be the case that the various factions within the party have to battle it out. Um, in terms of what are the best policies for the party moving forwards.
mm-hmm,
But I think that even if Labour was to win a fairly decent parliamentary majority, which is possible because the SNP are struggling now under Humza Yousaf's leadership in Scotland,
mm-hmm,
um, there is a possibility Labour could get a fairly decent parliamentary majority, but I think it's a very thin one. Because the reason I say that is because it could be more to do with disillusionment with the Conservatives, and there may be the case that many traditional Conservative voters simply stay home. Some may vote for the Reform Party. The more liberal-minded perhaps might vote for Liberal Democrat in certain parts of southern England. Think about places like Cheshire and Amersham.
mm-hmm,
But generally, it's more to do with apathy,
mm,
and more to do with the fact that there's only traditional Tory voters who are very disappointed in the Conservatives, who simply may not participate in the general election.
yeah. I think that's quite likely. Um, I mean, it will be interesting to see how Reform do, because at the moment, I don't think that Tice is an especially charismatic leader, right? And they're not. I don't think that they're being. I don't think they're taking a strategy that is most likely to win them votes. I mean, I think that if they were really serious about, um, attracting these disaffected Tories, they'd talk about immigration and crime on a loop forever, and they'd never, they I don't know, shut up about COVID vaccines or whatever it is that they're kind of. It's a bit. It's like it's got a cranky energy, right? The Reform Party. I mean, if Nigel Farage were to come back and to be, I know that he's been involved in it historically. If he were to become leader of Reform, that would likely. Um,
Yeah, indeed. It would be a game changer if Nigel was to return, and if there was to be a very focused message on immigration, law and order, but also culture issues surrounding national identity,
mm,
integration, could draw in many traditional Tory voters. But I
mm,
also think that it needs to be more than a kind of sort of Thatcherite tribute band as well.
mm,
It does need to talk a little bit about industrial strategy, investing in how we become a more self-sufficient nation
mm,
as well. So I think that at the moment, Reform could actually be on a much higher polling rating, if I'm being honest,
mm,
if their message was more, in my view, more appealing, and it was generally a more professional outfit.
mm. Yeah, I'm like, there's a pretty good chance that I'll vote for Reform, to be honest. We're in a safe Labour seat, so it doesn't really matter who we vote for. But the thing that would put me off, like, shouting about it or leafleting for them is, as you say, they don't have a very kind of, they have some PR problems. Admittedly, then they're generally not trying to appeal to the likes of me. So, I realise I'm not the target demographic, but yes, they are a bit sort of disorganised and cranky and so on. Um, which probably puts some voters off. But then I guess we've got a little way to go until the general election, so we'll see what happens in the meantime. Um, I wanted to ask as well about, partly going back to the Israel-Palestine thing we discussed earlier. Queers for Gaza has been attracting a lot of humour on social media because it is quite funny and there are lots of jokes to be made, chickens for KFC, all this sort of stuff. But there's also a serious point in there which I think is under discussed, which is some of these the I mean, the way that you framed your book, right, is around what progressives get wrong about ethnic minorities. And I think one of the things they get wrong is they don't realise actually how many points standard progressive politics is really at odds, actually, with, obviously there's variation across different ethnic minorities as we've discussed, but in general, British ethnic minorities are more socially conservative on a lot of things, particularly to do like all sorts of cultural things, including sexuality, transgenderism, sex outside marriage, all sorts of things where actually, your standards say, we talked about Bangladeshi women who love the police. Bangladeshi women love the police, and they probably also have quite like 1950s basically attitudes towards sex and gender issues. And I don't think that that's been sufficiently acknowledged by, as I said earlier, a lot of white progressive middle class people who just actually don't really speak to anyone outside of the social circles, don't really know what ethnic minority people actually think about any of these important issues. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.